when I was 18 years old, like most American kids, I went off to college. And I went to Colorado College in Colorado Springs, Colorado. And I had a miserable time in college. Academically, I wasn't doing very well. I was very unhappy socially. I was pretty confused. It's a more common story than we like to think. So I went home in the summer. I went to work for the Ford Motor Company. This was in 1966. And somehow the notion occurred to me, I don't remember exactly how, that I should join the Army. This caused my mother a lot of consternation, but I went through with it, and I did join the Army. And 2 years later, not very surprisingly, I ended up with orders to go to Vietnam. And so in the early summer of 1968, I got an airplane at Travis Air Force Base, and I went to Saigon and then went way out into the field in a very distant part of the Mekong Delta. And I served on an advisory team, infantry advisory team to the Vietnamese Army for a year. And I came home in May, I think it was May 19th of 1969. And I ended up, because of friends that were meeting me one afternoon on the campus of Berkeley, where a friend was trying to arrange transfer. And there was an enormous protest going on in Berkeley. And it was the People's Park protest, which was one of the iconic protests of the Vietnam War. And we walked over to the campus, I'll never forget this, and there was a violent confrontation with the crowds and the protesters and the state police and the National Guard who were there. Helicopters were circling overhead, and tear gas was being launched. This is 2 days after I got back from a combat assignment in Vietnam. And it was the reintroduction into the United States and was a moment of, needless to say, pretty deep confusion for me. We got out of there and went on with our lives the rest of the summer. I went back to college in the fall of '69, and the country was coming undone in the ways we all remember. And I had a really great piece of luck in that moment, and that was to come into the presence of a philosophy professor at Colorado College who was very well known there and in some circles around the country. His name was Glenn Gray. He was a phenomenologist and an existentialist, a scholar of Martin Heidegger, but other pieces of European continental philosophy as well. And because of that engagement, I became familiar with his own story and his own book, which is, I think, the single greatest book written in the 20th century in the United States on war. It's called The Warriors, Reflections on Men in Battle. And it's a philosophical autobiography of Glenn's time in Europe as an intelligence officer. He was on the European front for 4 years, an incredibly long time, and saw action in North Africa and Italy and France. And it was his attempt to come to terms with what he had experienced, which was pretty tough stuff. And here I was, 22 years old, about the age he was when he went to Europe in World War II. And that book, in some sense, completely reshaped my life. And I think it did because it gave me some purchase on my experience and a way to comprehend it. And it was, it was a pretty tough time. I still get kind of emotional when I think about it. But that introduction and that exposure to a philosopher trying to come to terms with his own life was, for me, epically important. And it changed my life. So that's my humanities moment. And it taught me a lot about how philosophy serves us in these ways and how the humanities in general speak to our experience and give us the means of making sense of what we live through. So it was a game changer. And I'm grateful to Glenn, who's now long since passed away. But that book endures and it holds up. I went back and read it last year, and it's every bit as good as it was then, and it's every bit as helpful to me now as it was then.